Tonight, let's begin our slow descent into one of the darkest chapters in human history, the story of the Black Death. It wasn't just a disease, it was a nightmare that changed the world forever. We begin in the year 1347. The calm waters of the Mediterranean gently carried a ship toward the port city of Messina in Sicily. From a distance, it looked like any other merchant vessel, large sails, wooden deck, familiar silhouette. But as it drew closer to the harbor, something felt wrong. Dock workers noticed no movement on board, no sailors shouting commands. Creaking ropes being pulled, only silence. When the ship finally reached port, the horror became clear. The crew, what remained of them, were barely alive. Some were slumped over barrels, flies buzzing around them. Others were lying motionless on the deck, faces covered in dark, oozing boils. This was no ordinary illness. It struck fast. It disfigured its victims, and it killed without mercy. By the time authorities ordered the ship away, it was too late. The Black Death had made landfall in Europe. From that one infected vessel, the disease spread like fire in the weeks that followed. Reports came from other ports, Marseille, Genoa, Venice, each telling the same tale. Sudden outbreaks, corpses piling up in the streets, fear spreading faster than any rumor. At first, people tried to deny it. They called it bad air, a curse, divine punishment. No one truly understood what was happening, but everyone could see that death was closing in, and with it, panic by winter. It wasn't just cities being affected. Remote villages, farms, monasteries, all felt the sting of plague. Some towns tried to isolate themselves, sealing their gates. Others held processions, hoping prayer would keep the illness away. But nothing stopped it, nothing slowed it. The disease moved faster than any messenger, crossed borders without horses, and silenced entire communities before help could arrive. It was only the beginning, and the world, though it didn't know it yet, would never be the same again. After the first ship docked in Messina in 1347, the plague spread faster than anyone could comprehend. It moved, not like a slow sickness, but like a wind, silent and unstoppable. The disease traveled along trade routes, both by land and by sea merchants. Unaware they were carriers, passed it from city to city. The fleas that lived on rats made their way onto carts, sacks of grain, and piles of cloth. And where the rats went, death followed. From Sicily, it reached Genoa, then Marseille. From there, it leaped north to France, Spain, and into the very heart of Europe. By the spring of 1348, it had crossed into England, from the coast to the capital. It spread in a matter of weeks. No city was too grand, no village was too remote. Even mountaintop monasteries reported cases. There was no safe place, no way to predict where it would strike next. Word of mouth traveled quickly, but not as fast as the plague. By the time rumors reached a town, the disease was often already there. People started abandoning their homes. Merchants refused to travel. Markets emptied. Prayers grew louder, more desperate. Governments were powerless. Many kings and nobles retreated to their countryside estates. They sealed themselves inside with their families and servants, hoping to wait out the storm. But servants got sick. Messengers brought more than just letters. The walls people built to keep death out often trapped it within. Ships arriving in ports were sometimes set on fire without ever being boarded. Towns would turn travelers away at sword point, but it was rarely enough. The plague didn't just move with people, it moved in the very breath they exhaled, and the more people tried to run, the more it followed. It had no borders, no loyalty, no mercy, and by the end of 1349, nearly all of Europe was within its grasp. To understand the horror of the Black Death, we must first understand the world it shattered before the plague. Europe was already fragile. The 14th century was a time of deep religious faith, rigid class systems, and a population growing faster than the land could feed. Most people were peasants. They lived in small villages, tied to the land and ruled by local lords. Their lives were shaped by the seasons, planting, harvesting, enduring the cold, and starting again. Life expectancy was low. Most children did not survive to adulthood, but even so, communities held strong. People found joy in simple things, festivals, family meals, storytelling by Firelight. Cities were growing rapidly, trade was booming, cathedrals were rising, stone by stone, reaching for the heavens. The church was powerful, not just spiritually, but politically. It owned vast lands, it controlled education, law, and nearly every aspect of daily life. People believed sickness was a punishment from God. They didn't know about germs or bacteria. Instead, they trusted in prayer, saints, and holy relics. At the same time, science was slowly taking root. Arabic medicine, ancient Greek texts, and new universities were spreading knowledge across Europe. But sanitation was poor. Waste lined the streets. Water was often contaminated in many towns. Animals and people lived under the same roof. Rats and fleas were everywhere, but no one gave them much thought. The roads were dusty. The inns were crowded. The ports were busy. All the conditions that would allow the plague to thrive were already in place, and yet no one saw it coming. There were warnings, strange lights in the sky, bad harvests, rumors from the east, but people didn't know what they were walking into. They still laughed, they still prayed, they still dreamed. The world before the plague was full of hope and hardship, faith and fear, and soon it would be changed forever. The first wave of the Black Death struck Europe with a speed and violence no one expected. From 1347 to 1351, the plague swept across the continent like a storm without mercy. Entire towns disappeared. In weeks, fields were left untended. The sound of weeping became more common than laughter. The symptoms were horrifying. It began with chills and fatigue. Then came the swellings, large, painful lumps that formed in the neck, underarms, and groin. These buboes turned black and filled with pus. People coughed blood, vomited, and often died within 3 to 5 days. It was quick, brutal, and inescapable. In cities, the dead filled homes, streets, and churches. In the countryside, neighbors would find whole families silent inside their cottages. Sometimes there was no one left to bury the bodies. Those who could fled to the hills. Others locked themselves in their homes. Doctors tried primitive treatments, bloodletting, herbal compresses, burning sulfur, but nothing worked. The infected were sometimes abandoned by their own families. Parents left children behind. Spouses fled from one. Another. Mass graves became common. Priests struggled to keep up with last rites, and when even the priests fell ill, communities lost what little hope they had left by the winter of 1349. The plague had reached the heart of Europe. Paris, London, Vienna, Florence, no great city was spared. Death did not care for wealth, title, or prayer. Some communities turned to violence. They blamed strangers, minorities, or anyone different. Fear became a second epidemic, but others showed surprising kindness. Monks cared for the sick, neighbors brought food to the dying. Acts of compassion flickered in the dark dot. By 1351, the first wave began to slow. There were fewer people to infect. The fire had burned through the forest, and when it passed, it left behind a different Europe, wounded, grieving, and changed forever. What was it like to live during the Black Death? For many, it meant waking up each day, unsure if it would be your last. The line between life and death blurred. One moment, you were well. The next, a cough, a chill, a swelling that signaled the end. People stopped planning for the future. Weddings were rushed. Wills were written. Some drank and celebrated, as if each night was their last, because it might be. Markets were empty. Schools closed. Churches were full, then silent. The streets were strangely quiet, or filled with the sounds of carts carrying the dead in some places. Silence fell in others. Chaos. Bands of desperate people roamed the countryside. Some were robbers, others were pilgrims searching for meaning, healing, or just someone still alive. Food became scarce. Crops were left unharvested, with fewer people to work the land. Prices rose. Many starved, not from plague, but from collapse. In cities, dogs and cats roamed freely. Cows wandered unattended. The normal order of things dissolved. People marked their doors to warn others. Red crosses, ropes, messages, scrawled in charcoal. Doctors wore long robes and beaked masks, filled with herbs to filter the air. They carried canes to examine patients from a distance, but even they rarely survived. Long clothing changed. People wore amulets and charms. Some covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar. Others bathed in urine or drank crushed emeralds, hoping for a cure. Music stopped. Fairs were canceled. But in the darkness, strange rituals began. Flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves in penance. They believed suffering might earn God's forgiveness. Crowds gathered to watch, and sometimes join. Each region, each family, each soul experienced the plague differently. But one thing was shared by all, a deep and growing sense that the world might be ending in the face of the Black Death. Medicine offered little hope. Doctors of the 14th century had no microscopes, no antibiotics, and no understanding of bacteria. What they had was a blend of ancient ideas, guesswork, and faith. The most accepted theory at the time was the miasma theory, the belief that the plague was caused by bad air. People thought foul smells carried disease, drifting in from swamps, decaying bodies, or even stars. To protect themselves, doctors wore long robes and those infamous beaked masks. The beaks were stuffed with herbs like lavender, mint, and cloves to purify the air. It looked strange, almost theatrical, but to them it was life-saving armor. Bloodletting was a common treatment. The idea was to drain the bad blood and restore balance. Patients were cut open with knives, or leeches were applied, weakening them further. Other cures were even stranger. Some drank mixtures of crushed pearls and mercury. Others burned aromatic woods, or sat between fires in the hope of cleansing the air. One remedy involved placing a plucked chicken against a bubo, the infected swelling, and hoping the disease would transfer to the bird. People also turned to astrology. Physicians created star charts to diagnose illness. They believed the alignment of planets, especially Saturn and Jupiter, had unleashed this disaster. Bathing was discouraged. Doctors feared water, opened the pores, and let in disease. Ironically, the refusal to bathe only worsened public hygiene, helping the plague spread. Apothecaries sold all manner of potions and powders. Some were based on Islamic medicine and ancient Greek texts. Others were little more than dust and superstition. Still, people clung to hope. Some healed perhaps by chance, or by having a stronger immune system. These survivors were hailed as miracles. But for most, the remedies were useless. And as the bodies piled up, even the healers began to vanish. In the medieval world, religion shaped every part of life and death. So when the Black Death began, people looked first to God for answers. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Sermons grew darker. Priests warned of judgment. Some said the end of the world had arrived. Churches overflowed with the sick and the desperate. Lit candles confessed their sins and begged for mercy. But even the priests began to die. Monks and nuns, who cared for the poor and ill, were often the first to fall. Entire monasteries were wiped out as the church lost its strongest servants. Panic grew. If even holy men could not be spared, what hope did anyone have? In the vacuum of fear, superstition took hold. Some communities turned on themselves. They blamed outsiders, especially Jewish communities, accusing them of poisoning wells or angering God. These baseless claims led to horrific pogroms. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Thousands were murdered, not by disease, but by fear. Elsewhere, the flagellants arrived. These were groups of men who marched barefoot from town to town, beating themselves with whips. They believed physical suffering could earn God's forgiveness. Crowds followed them, weeping and singing. In some towns, the flagellants were welcomed. In others, they spread fear and more violence. The Pope eventually condemned them, but by then, the movement had spread. People also began performing rituals not sanctioned by any religion. They wore talismans, burned herbs, buried offerings, and created chants to ward off death at night. The air was thick with incense and sorrow. Some turned away from religion altogether. They believed God had abandoned them or never existed at all. For many, faith was shaken. For others, it was the only thing left to hold on to. And through it all, the bells kept ringing, not for celebration, but for the dead. Before the plague, Europe's cities were alive with trade, music, and movement. But once the Black Death arrived, that rhythm began to unravel. At first, it was subtle. A few sick beggars in the square, a merchant who didn't open his stall, a priest who missed Mass. Then the symptoms appeared. People collapsed in the streets. Shouts turned to silence. Doors were marked with red crosses or left swinging open as entire families vanished. City officials tried to maintain order. Some imposed curfews. Others set up guards. But there were too many bodies and not enough hands to bury them in Florence. It was said that over 60% of the population died. In Paris, carts rolled endlessly through the streets, collecting the dead. London's cemeteries overflowed. New burial pits were dug every day. Commerce ground to a halt. Markets were empty. Ships floated in harbors. Abandoned blacksmiths, bakers, and butchers simply stopped showing up in some cities. The ruling class fled. Mayors, nobles, even doctors gone overnight. Those left behind had to survive however they could. Children begged for food. The elderly died alone. The poor searched empty homes for bread or even for shoes. With fewer guards and officials, crime surged. Theft, looting, and violence became common. And yet, there were moments of resilience. Neighbors nursed the sick. Writers kept diaries. Some doctors continued working, even when they knew what fate awaited them. Music fell silent, but so did judgment. Social rules faded. The poor and rich suffered alike. The plague was the great equalizer. When it finally passed through a city, the silence it left behind was haunting. Streets once filled with voices now echoed with the wind. Churches sat empty. Shops were boarded. Life had not paused. It had broken. And the world that rose from that rubble would never look the same again. Even in a time of horror, humans find ways to express their grief. And during the Black Death, that expression became darker, deeper, and more haunting. Before the plague, medieval art celebrated God, saints, and kings. It showed heaven, harmony, and divine order. But after the plague began, a new theme emerged: death itself. Skeletons, skulls, and dancing corpses became common in paintings and murals. This became known as the Dance of Death, a reminder that death comes for everyone, no matter their status. Nobles, peasants, priests, all were shown holding hands with the dead. It was not meant to frighten, but to teach. Death was no longer distant. It was a neighbor, a guest in every home. Writers, too, responded. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a story of 10 young people who fled plague-ridden Florence and passed the time by telling tales. The book is filled with laughter, love, and sorrow, a mirror of life during the plague in England. Poets began exploring darker themes. Religious plays focused on judgment and sin. Folk songs carried traces of loss. One of the most enduring rhymes, still known today, may have its roots in this time. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Though debated, many believe it reflects the symptoms and rituals of plague life. Architecture also changed. Gothic cathedrals grew taller, darker. Towers reached to the sky, perhaps in desperation. Grave markers became more detailed, not just names, but stories. Even clothing shifted. Black became common for mourning jewelry, with skulls or bones, was worn as a reminder of mortality. And yet, even in despair, beauty bloomed. Stained glass windows glowed. Manuscripts were painted by hand. People still sang, even if their songs were sad. The art of the plague wasn't just about death. It was about what it meant to live in its shadow. When fear takes hold, reason often disappears. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, many sought someone to blame. The pain was too great, the loss too sudden. Surely, someone had caused it. Whispers turned into accusations. rumors into rage in town after town. Jewish communities became the targets. They lived separately, spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and when others began to die, they were accused of poisoning wells. There was no evidence, only suspicion and centuries of prejudice under torture. Some confessed to crimes they never committed. That was all angry mobs needed to hear. Synagogues were burned, homes were raided, men, women, and children were slaughtered in the streets. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were killed in a single day. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was forced into a wooden house, which was then set on fire. Others were expelled, fleeing from one city to another. They found no refuge, and yet some places offered protection. A few nobles refused to believe the lies. They shielded the innocent, often at great personal risk, but such voices were rare. Scapegoating extended beyond the Jewish people. Strangers, travelers, beggars, anyone different was seen as suspicious. Even lepers and the mentally ill were blamed and sometimes executed. This wasn't just a time of disease, it was a time of moral collapse. Justice disappeared. Compassion was swallowed by fear. The irony is haunting. While mobs searched for someone to blame, the real cause, rats, fleas, bacteria, continued unnoticed. The plague did not discriminate, but people did, and in doing so, they added cruelty to tragedy. The Black Death killed millions, but humanity's response showed how fragile mercy can be in the face of fear. Before the plague, the church was the center of life in medieval Europe. It provided guidance, education, charity, and authority. The priest was more than a religious figure. He was the anchor of the community. So when the Black Death came, people turned first to the church. They prayed, they fasted, they confessed sins, and walked in barefoot processions, hoping for divine mercy. But as the death toll rose, the church began to falter. Priests died, thousands of them, in some towns. Entire monastic orders were lost. Mass was no longer held. Funerals became group burials. Last rites were rushed or skipped entirely. The faithful began to ask difficult questions. Why would God allow this? Why were the innocent dying? Why did prayers go unanswered? The silence was deafening. The church tried to explain. Some said it was punishment for human sin. Others blamed celestial alignments. But none of these answers satisfied the grief-stricken. A spiritual crisis spread alongside the disease. In desperation, some turned to extreme forms of worship, like the flagellants. These were men who marched across the countryside, whipping themselves in public, calling for repentance. At first, people welcomed them, but soon their influence grew dangerous, even challenging the church itself. The Pope condemned them, fearing their movement would fracture faith. Meanwhile, corruption within the church became more visible. Some clergy charged money for forgiveness. Others abandoned their flocks entirely. The people noticed, and they remembered. When the plague finally passed, many returned to the church, but their faith had changed. It was more personal, now more cautious, more questioning. Some became deeply devout. Others turned away forever. The Black Death didn't destroy the church, but it cracked its foundation. And in those cracks, new ideas would one day take root. By the year 1351, the Black Death had swept through nearly every corner of Europe. Tens of millions were gone. Some regions had lost half their population, others even more. The roads were quiet again, not from peace, but from absence. Villages stood empty. Homes crumbled. Church bells rang less often, because no one remained to ring them. And then, slowly, the plague began to fade. Not because of a cure, not because of human victory, but simply because there were fewer people left to infect. This was how the first great wave ended, not with celebration, but with exhausted silence. Nature reclaimed some of the land. Wild animals roamed freely in places once filled with people. Crops grew untended. The seasons continued, indifferent to human loss. For those who survived, the world was different. Entire families were gone. Trade routes had been disrupted. Skills, knowledge, and culture were scattered. Children wandered alone. Elders found themselves without anyone to teach. Land changed hands. Cities looked the same, but felt empty, and yet life persisted. Some towns began to rebuild. Markets reopened. People married, often quickly, to rebuild what had been lost. The survivors carried deep emotional scars. Many had watched loved ones die. Others had committed acts they could never forget, abandoning family, looting homes, burying neighbors in haste. They were changed, but they were also hardened. Europe had been reshaped. The first wave of the Black Death had burned through like a wildfire. It had destroyed millions of lives, shattered faith, and torn apart the social fabric. But it had also cleared the way for something new, a new chapter in history. Though no one knew it yet, the fire had burned out, but the embers still smoldered, and in time the flames would rise again. As the plague receded, another storm continued, one made not of disease, but of swords. The 100 Years' War had already begun before the plague arrived. It was a long, bitter conflict between England and France, a fight over crowns, territory, and pride. But the Black Death did not pause for kings. When the plague hit, battles ceased. Armies were too weak to fight. Soldiers fell ill. Commanders died. Even the horses collapsed in their stables. But as soon as the plague faded, the war resumed, and now it was a different kind of war. The armies were smaller. The strategies had changed. So had the people. With so many nobles dead from the plague, power shifted. New lords rose. Old alliances crumbled. The land was not just wounded by disease, but by fire, sword, and siege. Villages caught in the middle suffered doubly. 1 year, the plague, the next. War. Fields were burned. Homes were looted. Peasants were taxed heavily to fund battles they did not understand. In many places, famine followed. Crops had been left unattended during the plague. War destroyed what remained. And yet, amidst the conflict, the old world began to crack. Feudalism, the ancient system where peasants served lords, began to weaken. There were simply not enough workers left. Those who survived could demand higher wages. They could move. They had choices. Lords resisted laws, were passed to freeze wages, to tie workers to the land. But people pushed back. Rebellions flared, not just in England and France, but across Europe. The plague had loosened the chains. The war had tested the bonds. And now society itself was starting to shift. The 14th century was no longer just the age of plague. It had become the age of upheaval. And in that turbulence, the seeds of modern Europe were beginning to grow. As the plague swept through Europe, desperation gave rise to strange and extreme behavior. Some people turned inward, others lashed outward, but a growing number chose something else entirely: punishment, public, painful, and self-inflicted. They were called the asterisk, F-L-A-G-E-L-L-A-N-T-S, asterisk. Groups of men, often barefoot and dressed in rags, marched from town to town in long lines. They stopped in public squares, they knelt in silence, and then they began to whip themselves over and over. They struck their own backs with leather cords or iron-tipped lashes. The flagellants believed the plague was punishment from God for humanity's sins, and if no one else would atone, they would do it themselves. Their processions were grim and theatrical. They sang hymns, they chanted Latin prayers, they carried crosses and war hoods, some marked with red symbols of Christ's wounds. And as they walked, crowds gathered. At first, people welcomed them. They saw the flagellants as holy men, suffering so others might be spared. But as their numbers grew, their behavior became more radical. They claimed divine visions. They accused priests of corruption, and sometimes they encouraged violence against those seen as sinners, especially Jews and outsiders. The Catholic Church grew alarmed. The Pope issued warnings. In 1349, Pope Clement VI formally condemned the movement. He feared it would divide the Church and stir chaos. Still, the flagellant processions continued in some places until they were banned, arrested, or simply lost followers. Eventually, as the worst of the plague passed, the movement faded, but for a time, the flagellants were everywhere, a reminder of how fear can drive people not just to pray, but to bleed in the open, hoping that pain might bring forgiveness in their wounds. They carried the weight of a world they no longer understood. In the face of invisible death, isolation became the only defense. As the Black Death spread from town to town, people began to realize something terrifying. It moved with them. Merchants brought it, sailors brought it, travelers unknowingly carried death from port to port, city to city, and so some communities made a choice: shut the gates. Towns put up barricades, villages blocked roads. In some places, guards stood at the borders, refusing entry to outsiders, even if they begged. This was the beginning of quarantine. In Venice, ships arriving from infected regions were forced to anchor offshore. They had to wait 40 giorni to 40 days before passengers or cargo could come ashore. The word quarantine comes from that rule. 40 means 40 in Italian. Other cities followed. In Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, officials created one of the first formal quarantine stations. Travelers were held in isolated buildings, sometimes for weeks, before being allowed inside the city walls. It wasn't perfect. No one yet understood bacteria or how the plague actually spread. But isolating the sick, or the potentially sick, began to slow the tide. Inside cities, fear spread just as fast. If a family member showed symptoms, some households locked them in a room and refused to enter. Others fled entirely, abandoning the sick to die alone in wealthier homes. Servants were sent out instead. Poorer families had no such options. Even monasteries and convents closed their doors. Some tried to isolate the entire community to keep death out. It didn't always work. the plague was already everywhere, in the air, in the rats, in the people. But quarantine was a start, a sign that humanity was beginning to look for patterns, for logic, for control. Out of the fear came a small spark of public health, not science, not yet, but something close. And centuries later, when new diseases came, the world would remember this lesson. Sometimes the best protection is distance. In the year 1348, the Black Death crossed the Channel and reached the shores of England. It arrived, quietly carried by a ship, just like it had in Sicily. But within weeks, that quiet turned to panic. The first major outbreak began in the port city of Melcombe Regis, in Dorset. From there, the disease moved inland. Fast, by summer, it had reached London. England's capital was already crowded, dirty, and overrun with rats. Its narrow alleys, open sewage, and packed marketplaces made it the perfect breeding ground. Soon, bodies began to pile up. Churchyards overflowed. Mass graves were dug in fields, and the toll grew higher each day. Monks wrote that every day seemed to bring 1,000 funerals. The government tried to respond, but there was little it could do. Parliament was delayed. Courts stopped meeting. Even the king, Edward III, fled London to escape the plague's reach. Still, the sickness followed. No one was spared, rich or poor, noble or commoner. The Archbishop of Canterbury died, and entire city councils, trade slowed to a crawl. Boats stayed in harbor shops. Closed people stopped showing up to work or to church. The countryside didn't fare any better as the plague moved north. It reached Yorkshire, then Northumberland, and eventually crossed into Scotland and Ireland in villages. Entire communities vanished. In some places, only children were left crying beside the dead. Chroniclers wrote of towns where no dogs barked, no bells rang, no voices spoke, only silence. And yet, life continued somehow. Some people turned to faith, others to drink or superstition, but many simply endured. They watched as loved ones disappeared, and they waited, hoping the disease would pass them by. England had faced wars, famine, and rebellion before, but never this. The plague didn't just claim lives, it left a scar across the island, a memory of fear that would last for centuries. Of all the losses brought by the Black Death, none were more heartbreaking than the loss of children. The young, with their small bodies and weaker resistance, were among the most vulnerable. Many fell sick and died within days, some within hours. Parents held their children as they burned with fever, swollen with buboes, helpless to stop the suffering. In towns and villages, entire schoolhouses, emptied playgrounds were abandoned, cribs left untouched. Those children who survived faced a world transformed. They lost not just siblings, but parents, grandparents, teachers, and neighbors. Some were orphaned, others were adopted into distant families, sent to work, or left to fend for themselves. The social safety nets of the time were thin. There were no orphanages, no child services, just the mercy of strangers. In many households, the line between childhood and adulthood vanished overnight. A 10-year-old might now be the head of the household. A 12-year-old might be working in fields, or apprenticed in a trade to replace a dead craftsman. Children grew up faster because they had to. Some historians believe this sudden shift reshaped how childhood was seen. that children became more precious because they were so easily lost, and more capable because they had no choice. Artists began to depict children in new ways. Writers described their suffering with deeper emotion, and laws slowly changed to offer some protections. The trauma of the plague lived on in those who were young when it struck, even as adults. They remembered the fear, the funerals, the silence of empty homes, and though they rarely spoke of it, that memory shaped how they raised their own children, how they built their towns, how they valued life. The Black Death didn't just take children, it took childhood itself, and in the years that followed, those who survived carried that loss. Like a shadow into every part of the future, the Black Death didn't just end lives, it upended the economy of Europe before the plague. The continent was overcrowded, too many people, too little land, wages were low, and work was hard to find. Most peasants worked as serfs, bound to the land, tied to their lords, and locked into a system that left them poor. Then the plague struck in just a few short years. The population of Europe shrank by nearly half. Suddenly, there were too few workers, not too many, and that changed everything. Fields lay fallow, shops were empty, craftsmen were gone, cities were quiet. Landowners, desperate to save their harvests, began offering higher wages. They lowered rents. They promised freedom. The value of human labor skyrocketed. For the first time in generations, peasants had leverage. They could choose where to work. They could negotiate. Some even bought land, a right once unthinkable. In cities, a new middle class began to form. Artisans, merchants, and skilled workers gained power and independence. Towns grew, markets reopened, and trade slowly returned. But not everyone welcomed the change. Kings and nobles, afraid of losing control, passed new laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. In England, the Statute of Laborers tried to force workers to accept pre-plague wages. It didn't work. The world had changed, and no law could reverse it. The Black Death had broken the back of an old system, and in its place, something new began to rise. The world where common people had value, where work meant power, and where a laborer could dream of a future beyond servitude. The plague created a terrible wound, but from it, a more flexible, more dynamic economy began to take root. And in that shift, the seeds of modern Europe were quietly planted. For centuries, serfdom was a fact of life. Peasants were tied to the land, owing service to a lord in exchange for protection. They couldn't leave. They couldn't own land. They had few rights and fewer choices. But the Black Death changed all of that, with millions dead. Landowners were desperate. Entire villages stood empty. Harvests failed because no one was left to work the fields. So lords began making offers. They granted freedom to some serfs, offered wages instead of forced labor, allowed mobility in exchange for loyalty at first. This seemed temporary, a way to survive the crisis. But it didn't stop. As serfs moved from one estate to another, looking for better conditions, they began to realize something profound. They didn't have to stay serfdom, relied on tradition, fear, and economic pressure. Now, the pressure was gone. In England, the effects were dramatic. More and more peasants left their lords behind, settling in towns or becoming tenant farmers. They paid rent, not labor, and they wanted rights. This shift frightened the upper classes. Kings passed laws to force people back into old roles, but it was too late. The foundations had cracked. Serfdom would wither and disappear in much of Western Europe, not overnight, not everywhere, but steadily. Like ice melting under sunlight, the plague had loosened the chains, and the survivors refused to wear them again. In Eastern Europe, serfdom would last longer. But even there, the ideas had taken root. People began to ask questions. Why should one man own another's labor? Why should birth decide a person's fate? The Black Death had struck blindly, rich and poor alike, and in its aftermath, the lie of noble superiority seemed thinner. Freedom came slowly, but it came, and for millions of former serfs, it meant more than survival. It meant possibility, even in darkness. People tell stories. The Black Death didn't just leave behind bodies and broken homes. It left behind words, images, ideas. Some of the most powerful came from writers and artists who lived through it. In Italy, a young man named Giovanni Boccaccio began writing a book called The Decameron. It told the story of 10 young people fleeing plague-ridden Florence to pass the time. They told each other tales, funny, sad, romantic, and strange. But beneath the stories was a quiet truth that even as the world crumbled, people still longed to laugh, to love, and to live. Petrarch, another Italian writer, wrote hundreds of letters and poems during the plague years. His words speak of grief and confusion, but also a fierce desire to understand. He asked why God allowed such pain. He wondered what lessons might be found in sorrow. In France, Jean de Venette, a monk, wrote one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts of the plague, describing funeral pyres, deserted cities, and the terror in people's eyes. Artists responded to before the plague. Religious paintings showed saints, angels, and heavenly scenes. After, they showed death, often riding a pale horse, cutting down rich and poor alike. The theme of Dance of Death appeared, skeletons leading kings, bishops, and beggars in a grim procession. It was a reminder: no one escapes church. Walls were covered in murals of this dance. Manuscripts were filled with images of skulls, coffins, and time slipping away. And yet, art didn't stop. It adapted. Painters explored deeper emotions. Writers searched for meaning in this time of suffering. Creativity became a form of survival. It was a way to make sense of loss, to honor the dead, and to remember that even as life fades, the human voice endures. The Black Death left behind silence, but also stories. And in those stories, the survivors found a way to live again. Most believed the Black Death was over by 1351. The cemeteries quieted, the cities slowly reopened, and the survivors began to rebuild. But the plague wasn't finished. In 1361, just a decade later, the second wave arrived. It swept across Europe again, not as violently as before, but still deadly. This time, it seemed to strike the young even harder. Entire generations of children born after the first wave were taken. The rhythm of the disease became hauntingly familiar. Swelling glands, sudden fever, swift decline. Doctors recognized it instantly, but they still had no cure. The second wave wasn't the last. More outbreaks followed in 1369, in 1374, in 1383, in 1390. Each new wave took more lives, though fewer than the first. Still, communities were scarred again and again. The third major wave, in the early 1400s reignited fear. By now, plague had become a recurring part of life, like a dark season that returned without warning. Some towns kept plague records, others built plague houses, where the sick were isolated. In England, watchmen were hired to guard infected homes. Red crosses were painted on doors. Sometimes families were locked inside and left to fate. The plague didn't burn out quickly. It lingered for centuries, even into the 1600s. New outbreaks struck cities like London and Marseille. The Great Plague of 1665 killed over 100,000 people in England alone. The Black Death wasn't a single event. It was a shadow that stretched across generations, and as each wave passed, the memory deepened, not just of death, but of survival. A quiet strength began to take hold. Communities rebuilt faster. Responses became more organized. Still, the fear never left. People whispered about omens. They watched the skies. They lit candles and locked doors. The plague had become part of the world's rhythm, a reminder that life was fragile and death never far behind. When the Black Death first struck, it seemed like an ending, but in time, it became a beginning. The plague didn't just kill, it changed Europe forever. After the initial devastation, population decline reshaped everything. With fewer people, there was more land, more food, more opportunities. Feudalism, already weakening, began to unravel. Serfs demanded freedom. Peasants moved to towns. Cities grew rapidly. Labor became valuable. Wages rose. A middle class emerged. Trade routes shifted. Local economies diversified. And power began to spread beyond the old. Noble families in art. Death became a central theme. Skulls, clocks, and wilting flowers reminded viewers of life's fragility. But so did beauty, intimacy, and emotion. Architecture changed too. Churches were built smaller, more somber. Cemeteries moved outside city walls. Hospitals and almshouses expanded. Education, once limited to clergy, reached more people. Universities grew. Literacy rose. People questioned old truths in the church. Cracks appeared. The plague had shown that priests could die like anyone else, that faith, while comforting, didn't always protect. Some believers turned inward. Others sought new answers. This questioning spirit laid the groundwork for reform in science. The seeds of modern medicine were quietly planted. Observation replaced superstition. Cause and effect began to matter. Some cities hired public health officials. Others cleaned streets or controlled trade. During outbreaks, these were small steps, but real ones. And beyond all that, something subtle shifted. A new individualism emerged. People began to see themselves not just as members of a class or guild, but as individuals with worth, choices, and voices. The plague had taken so much, but it had also cleared a space, and in that space, something new grew. Renaissance, reform, revolution. The Black Death didn't just scar Europe, it transformed it. When people today picture the Black Death, one image stands out: a man in a long black robe with a wide-brimmed hat, and a bird-like mask with a long, curved beak. The plague doctor, striking, sinister, iconic. But how accurate is this image? The truth is more complicated. and more recent than most think. During the first wave of the Black Death in the 1300s, these masks did not exist. In fact, the famous beaked costume wasn't introduced until the 1600s. Over 300 years later, it was created in France and Italy as a kind of early hazmat suit. The idea was to protect the doctor from miasma, bad air, which was thought to carry disease. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, lavender, mint, rose petals, even vinegar-soaked sponges. Doctors believed the scent would filter and purify the air. The rest of the outfit included a waxed cloak, gloves, boots, and a stick used to examine patients from a distance. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't very effective, but it was an early attempt at protective equipment, despite their dramatic appearance. Plague doctors were not always skilled physicians. Many were hired by towns in desperation. Some were surgeons, others were barbers. A few were barely trained at all. They recorded deaths, offered advice, and often treated the sick with old remedies, bloodletting leeches, or herbal mixtures. Some were brave, others fled at the first sign of illness. Over time, their image became mythic. Artists began to draw them with skulls and wings. Stories painted them as grim reapers, cursed wanderers, or agents of doom. Today, plague doctors have become a symbol of fear, medicine, and mystery. But the truth is simpler. They were men trying to help in a world that didn't yet understand disease, and in their long shadows, we can still see the outlines of modern medicine, still learning, still adapting, still trying. Behind the mask was just a person, trying not to die. What was it like to live during the Black Death? Not as a king or a doctor, but as an ordinary person, a weaver, a mother, a baker, a child. For most, it began with whispers news from another village, a rumor at the market. Then, someone nearby fell sick, and everything changed. Shops closed, markets emptied, church bells rang endlessly. Every cough drew glances, every shadow brought fear in cities. The streets were quiet, or filled with carts carrying bodies. Some people locked themselves inside, others fled. Entire farms were abandoned. Animals wandered unattended. Fields went unharvested. Food became scarce. So did candles. So did clean water. If you got sick, your options were few. Most people stayed home. They drank herbal teas. They prayed. Doctors were rare. And even if they came, they often couldn't help. Neighbors stopped visiting. Friends stayed away. The sick often died alone. But daily life didn't stop. Children still cried. Bread still needed baking. Animals still needed feeding. People tried to keep going because they had to. They wore charms. They burned incense. Some drew crosses above their doors. And when a loved one died, they buried them as best they could. Sometimes in churchyards, sometimes in fields, sometimes not at all. Yet, even in this darkness, there were moments of light, a shared meal, a whispered prayer, a kind gesture from a stranger. Life continued, stubborn and quiet, and when the plague passed, those who remained picked up the pieces. They returned to the fields. They reopened their shops. They rebuilt daily. Life during the plague was not heroic or grand. It was slow, heavy, full of waiting, watching, and hoping. But it endured, and in that endurance there was strength. The Black Death finally passed. The fevered cries fell silent. The smoke of burning clothes faded. The carts stopped rolling through the streets. But for those who survived, the ordeal was far from over. They stepped into a world forever changed, familiar. Faces were missing. Entire families gone. Neighbors, friends, merchants, lost without farewell. There were houses with doors nailed shut, villages that stood empty. Church bells that hadn't rung in months. Survivors carried grief like a second skin. Some were racked with guilt. Why me? Why not them? Others became numb, tired, distant. In cities, life had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Trades had vanished. Guilds were shattered. Crops rotted in the fields for lack of hands. But in this emptiness came opportunity. Peasants found work where there was none before. Women stepped into roles once closed to them. Children inherited farms. Unsure who might carry illness, faith was shaken or strengthened. Each person processed the pain in their own quiet way. Some looked to the stars, others to God, and still others to no one at all. There were no counselors, no guides, just time and memory. And yet, despite everything, they endured, they married, they planted, they rebuilt walls, roads, and markets. Life, stubborn as ever, returned. But the scars remained in the silence before a storm, in the smell of smoke, in the way people flinched at a cough. The plague had passed, but it never truly left. The Black Death feels like ancient history. Could it happen again? The answer is yes. Diseases still cross borders. They still leap from animals to humans. They still spread on the wind, in water, or by touch. The world today is more connected than ever. A flight can carry infection across oceans in hours. A market stall can become ground zero. In 1918, a new flu pandemic swept the globe, killing millions. In recent years, outbreaks of SARS, Ebola, and COVID-19 reminded us that pandemics are not relics, they are realities. The difference now is knowledge. We understand viruses. We have vaccines, hospitals, sanitation. We can track outbreaks in real time, but fear still spreads faster than facts, and the same challenges remain. Disbelief, inequality, mistrust. During the Black Death, people blamed the stars. Today, some blame science. Isolation still divides. Rumors still harm, and some still hoard while others go without. But we also learn. We build systems, share data, support one another. Could another plague sweep the world? Yes, but we are not the same world that faced it in 1347. We have memory now. We have voices that remember the silence, and we have choices to prepare to. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. The Black Death left more than empty streets. It left questions about life, disease. How strength and kindness can survive, even in silence. Lesson 1. Human life is interconnected. One ship, one rat, one traveler, and the world changed forever. In our world, connections are even tighter. What happens far away affects us here. Understanding this is not fear, it's wisdom. Lesson 2. Leadership matters. During the plague, some leaders fled, others stayed and served. Some priests died, giving last rites. Others, knowledge. People turn on each other. Today, the challenge remains. Truth saves lives. Lies cost them. Lesson 4. Asterisk, even in ruin, People rebuild asterisk, asterisk, not out of bravery, not out of hope, but because life demands it. Survivors kept going. They farmed, wrote, prayed, painted, they remembered. The Black Death was one of history's darkest hours, but it also sparked change in labor, in law, in learning. Pain shaped progress, and perhaps that's the final lesson, that even the worst moments leave space for something new, not better, not fairer, but different. And in that difference, possibility. The Black Death came like a shadow. It slipped across seas, over fields, through locked doors. It whispered through cities, screamed in villages, and left silence in its wake. And yet, humanity survived. We remember the numbers. 25 million dead in Europe alone. But the real story lies in the lives that remained. The mother who buried her child and still found the strength to feed her. Neighbor, the priest who stayed, the writer who recorded, the healer who tried. History honors the powerful dot, but in this story, it's the quiet endurance that matters most. The weaver who returned to her loom, the orphan, showed what held and what broke, what comforted and what failed. And in its aftermath, their clergy, their world, the modern world, in many ways, was born in that darkness, not because of it, but in spite of it. Tonight, we've walked with the past, not to fear it, but to understand it, because every age has its plagues, some of disease, some of fear, some of silence, and history reminds us we've been here before, we found a way through, and we will again. Thank you for joining us. Sleep well.